Great. Thank you so much, Laura. Next slide, please. Greetings, everyone. Thank you all for taking the time out of your day or your evening to be with us to learn about the new accessibility guidance that's coming out in the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines version 2.2, otherwise known as WCAG 2.2. We have so much to talk about in so little time. Our goal here is to provide a brief background on WCAG, introduce you to the new WCAG 2.2 success criteria, highlight some information about WCAG and regulations and the future of WCAG, and wrap up with some questions and answers. Next slide. Please let me introduce myself. My name is Melanie Phillip. I've been with DECUE for about 12-ish years, and I currently serve as DECUE's Director of Services Methodology. Part of my work in that role has been working with the W3C's Accessibility Guidelines Working Group since 2017. I also serve as DECUE's Advisory Committee representative to the W3C. And Wilco, please introduce yourself.
You bet, Melanie. So my name is Wilco Fierce. I have been with DECUE for 6-ish years. I'm the product owner of XCore and XLinter. So I'm responsible for much of DECUE's fully automated testing suite. I'm based in Europe, hence my DECUE Systems Europe is where I'm officially employed. I am the project manager of WCAG 3 at the W3C, which I do on behalf of DECUE Systems, as well as I am the facilitator of the Accessibility Conformance Testing Task Force, which is a group within the W3C that also falls under the Accessibility Guidelines work.
Great, thank you, Wilco. And so with that, let me dive on in here. First, for those of you who are newer to the world of WCAG, let me give a few high-level bullet points about it. Next slide, please. You might wonder where these guidelines come from. They're developed by the World Wide Web Consortium, or the W3C. The W3C was founded by Tim Berners-Lee, the creator of the internet, back in 1994. The W3C's goal was and is to create specifications to standardize how web content works across different platforms, initially web browsers, but today so much more. Within the W3C, WCAG is developed and maintained by the Accessibility Guidelines Working Group, AGWAG, otherwise known as AGWAG, through volunteers from W3C member organizations and invited experts. The purpose of WCAG is to advise web content authors on how to make web content more accessible for people with disabilities. While the charter of AGWAG is limited to web technologies, the authors had foresight to describe the guidelines in technology agnostic terms so that its principles could extend to other digital technologies. While the W3C's specifications are meant to be voluntarily adopted by digital technology providers, WCAG has, in fact, been adopted by regulations and legal rulings across the globe. I'll highlight some of those regulations toward the end of the webinar. You'll hear Wilco and me talk about levels as we introduce new success criteria. WCAG success criteria are labeled with 3 levels. A, the lowest or most basic level of accessibility guidance. AA is the next level up and includes all of the A requirements plus additional AA criteria. And finally, AAA, which includes all the criteria. For your reference, pretty much all regulations and legal rulings reference AA, not AAA. However, many organizations that are committed to digital equality for a wider range of people will consider adopting one or more AAA criteria in their digital accessibility policy. Next slide. Many of you might be surprised by how long WCAG has been around. So let's take a quick look at its timeline. The first version of WCAG was developed in the late 1990s, last century, and became a recommendation in 1999. I can tell you the web looked a whole lot different back then. And I know that because that's when I started coding web pages, literally in Windows Notepad and rendering them in Internet Explorer. But after WCAG 1 was published, work soon began on WCAG 2, which was published about 9 years later in 2008. Another 10 years went by, and version 2.1 was published in 2018. At that point, almost immediately work began on 2.2, and here we are. We expect it to be officially published like literally any day now. So in parallel to all the work on 2.1 and 2.2, work on a massive reimagining of the WCAG framework has been underway in WCAG 3, which is another webinar for another day. But if you want to see where they are at this point, there is a working draft of 3.0 out for you to review. Next slide. So what is new in 2.2? Next. As I'm speaking to you, WCAG 2.2 is currently a proposed recommendation. Without going into the details of the W3C process for publishing technical standards, this means that it is so close to becoming a full recommendation. So highlights of the new 2.2 features include 9 new success criteria. 2 of them are at A, 4 at AA, and 3 more at AAA. And in addition to that, we have the existing success criterion 411 parsing is being removed from 2.2 altogether. These new criteria enhance guidance, especially for 2 groups, people with mobility disabilities and people with cognitive disabilities. And with that, I'm going to turn things over to Wilco to talk about the 5 new criteria and to enhance mobility accessibility.
Thanks, Melanie. So let's start off with the mobility improvements that come in WCAG 2.2. First up on our list is the criteria 2.4.11 and 2.4.12, which focus on focus not being obscured. This is a AA and a AAA success criterion. So we've got 2 for the price of 1. And the persona quote here is, "Hey, stop hiding my keyboard focus." And to summarize what this success criterion is about is when you navigate by keyboard, the focus ring that appears on the page must not be obscured or covered up by some other content. And the difference between the AA and the AAA requirement is that at AA, partial obscuring is still allowed, but at AAA, no obscuring whatsoever. So at AA, the focus needs to be somewhat visible, and at AAA, the full focus needs to remain visible. That's the important difference between the 2. And this benefits people mainly using keyboard navigation, who rely on this focus to understand where they are in the page and what they can interact with. An example here on my screen is one where there's a cookie banner that pops up that sits kind of as you focus through the page. It sits halfway on top of a link that has focus on it. And because it's halfway on top of it, the focus is still visible. So it passes the AA level, but it fails the AAA level. Key concepts to understand here, there's common failures. By far the most common one is going to be on cookie banners. These are all over the web, and we are just going to need to be very careful with how we use them. Sticky headers is also an issue. Remember, keyboard focus doesn't just go from top to bottom. It can go from the bottom to the top as well. People will first navigate, and so they may find their focus getting stuck behind sticky headers. So watch out for that. Submenus, when they expand on a page and don't automatically collapses as focus navigates away. And chat widgets are also a fairly common example of things that obscure focus. These chat widgets, especially the ones sticking at the bottom right of your page and then popping up, and then they sit on top of a bunch of other content, that can be a real problem. The thing to understand here, if the interface is configurable, so that the user can move the toolbar or the modal or whatever pops up. The initial position is what matters here. So if the user moved the thing around and they placed it in a place that obscures the focus, that's not the responsibility of the content author, but it's the initial position that counts here. An example of that might be a drawing application which has toolbars which you can move around to better suit your needs. The next success criterion is dragging movement, which is criterion 257, which is a AA level criterion. The persona quote here is, I can't do this drag and drop. I need another way to do this. The way to understand drag and drop movement here is that you need to provide some way using a pointer device or a mouse or touch that lets you operate a control that doesn't mean touch down, move your finger and hold it down and then release. And this helps people with mobility difficulties, especially if for some people, it might be difficult to press and hold down and precisely control your movement. So those are the people that benefit from the success criterion. A common example of that are sliders, where you have to press and hold down on the thumb of the slider to move it to a certain position. If there's a way to input that information through a text input, for example, might be a sufficient way to accomplish that, or up or down buttons that might be adjacent to the slider. That's not a way to accomplish something like that. Another example that's fairly common are Kanban boards, where you have cards that may be moved around between different swim lanes. Dragging those cards around is fine as long as there's another way to accomplish that using a pointer. How to understand drag and drop itself, which is slightly different from other touch-based navigations. Drag and drop specifically here refers to touching or clicking a specific point or a user interface element, then holding and moving it to a different location and releasing at that different location. So that is specifically what we're talking about with the success criterion. And an important thing to understand and distinguish it, this is different from the requirement 2.1 keyboard, 2.1 keyboards, in that this requires that you provide some way to do this with a pointer event. So even if your drag and drop has some keyboard accessible alternative, great, you should have that. But you also need to have a way to make that work with a touchscreen. That's the main difference between this is a touchscreen focused success criterion. The next success criterion to look at is 258, target size minimum. This comes along with a target size enhanced criterion that was introduced in WCAG 2.1. Target size enhanced was a AAA success criterion. The new one is a AA success criterion. So, and the persona quote is, I need the button to be big enough that I can press the right one. A common problem for people with mobility issues is that buttons may be just too small or too close to each other, that it's difficult to activate the right one. This is specifically different from the AAA success criterion, which requires that targets have enough size. This success criterion is about either you have enough size by default, or the control is sufficiently spaced away from another control that you don't activate the wrong one. That's the worst thing here that can happen, is that you accidentally submit something that you didn't mean to submit, or open a page that you didn't mean to open. Even if it takes you an extra try or two extra tries to get to the right control, not activating the wrong one is the most important thing here. Some examples of that On my screen, the first image are round buttons. The minimum size required for controls is 24 pixels. And these round buttons have a diameter of 24 pixels, so they pass. The second image below that is of horizontally spaced links, which, even though the link itself might not be exactly 24 pixels, as long as the space between the links is 24 pixels, that meets that requirement. And the same is true for the next image, where there's a menu that collapses. This is by far the most common scenario, is links stacked on top of each other or little images adjacent to each other. That's where you see a lot of these problems coming from very small target sizes. The way to understand the spacing requirement specifically is that even if a link has a height of 16 pixels, the way to measure whether or not that meets the requirement is that you draw an imaginary circle on the center of your link or your button. And if that imaginary circle, that's 24 pixels in diameter, doesn't intersect another target or another imaginary circle from a small target, then the link is or the control is sufficiently spaced. So if you have on my screen a bar of controls that is 16 pixels high, that it stands by itself. Just because they're 16 pixels high doesn't matter, because above and below there's enough space for those controls. But if there's two rows of those same controls, because those rows are stacked on top of each other, they intersect with each other. So the circles intersect with both the center of the circles of the targets below it and the target itself. So that's how to think of it. If you need to be able to place a circle 24 pixels in diameter on the center of your control. And if that's the case, the control meets the spacing requirement. It's a little complicated, fair enough. But I'll show you an easy way to test that in a little bit. The second thing to understand is that there's an exception of equivalence. If a control has an alternative that lets you achieve the same thing on the same page, that does have sufficient size or is sufficiently spaced, then the first control, it passes also. So only one of the things. So you can provide alternatives. If you have some small space, but there's alternatives available that let you achieve the same thing, that works fine. The third exception to target size is an inline exception. A common issue here is for links inside of text, because text itself, you can't often adjust the line height sufficiently. There's an exception for links that run inside of text. If that wasn't the case, you would require all of the line height of every link to be 24 pixels, and that the default line height of 24 pixels just makes text more difficult to read. So there's some intersection between accessibility needs there that require that an exception be added for inline links. Another exception, and there's quite a lot of them, is for user agent controls. You don't always control the size of things that a browser provides. Common things that are not 24 pixels, they should be, but it's not the content author's fault, are select elements. Checkboxes are really kind of small. Date pickers tend to be really kind of small. If you're building these yourself, these requirements apply. They have to have the 24 pixel offset. But if you're using the browser's default, it's on the browser to fix that problem. So that is an exception as well. And the last exception, finally, is exception 5, essential. There are scenarios where things just have to be close to each other. An example of that is a map. If things are on the map that are interactive. You cannot just move the things or make them larger. Things sometimes on maps are just small. They have to be, because on the map they're not far apart. Another exception are legal requirements. There are certain forms where using the exact same spacing as a paper form is required. So that might be another exception where it is essential that things be close to each other, because there's a legal requirement to follow that. And I'm going to show a quick demo of how to use this in XDevTools. We have been working on building a rule into Xcore, which is available in our browser extension and in all of our other products as well, which can do much of this target size testing automatically. So you don't have to go over every link on a page to find this out for yourself. So I will minimize screen share and show a page. This is a little demo page, the Gefalscht web shop that we have. And there are a number of links on this page which do not quite meet those requirements. So the way to test for this is to open the browser extension, which I can do with Command-Shift-I, or I can left click and go to inspect. And then from there in the developer tools, I go to the XDevTools extension. You do need to have the extension installed. And after you've logged in, you do currently need a Pro account to get to the settings. You need to be sure to go to settings, and then under the Pro features, once you've logged in, you can select an accessibility standard, and you have to make sure to include WCAG 2.2, either AA or AAA, and save that. So once you have the WCAG 2.2 rule set enabled, this is not enabled by default, but it will be in some point in the nearest future, TBD exactly when. You can analyze the page. That will then scan for different issues. And one of the issues reported is all touch targets must be 24 pixels large or at least sufficiently spaced. And this shows 9 issues found. And if I activate the highlighter, that shows me a link at the bottom of the page, which from the look of it is 14 pixels tall. And the browser extension reports this too. It is 70 pixels by 14.5 pixels, and it should be at least 24 by 24. Or option 2 is its closest neighbor is at least 24 pixels, but instead what it is, it's almost 20. So that is not quite close enough. And if I go through some of the other examples too, you'll see it found all of these links here in the bottom of the page, which are all in the footer, which are all too close. Like I said, horizontally stacked links are very commonly problems. Back to my slide. On to the next success criterion, which is 2412 focus appearance, which is a AAA success criterion. This is one thing that changed sort of last minute. It was hoped and tried to have this success criterion at AA. We didn't quite make it. The complexity of that was really what made this a problem. So this ended up as a AAA success criterion. And the persona quote for this is, where in the world is my keyboard focus? And the thing that tests for keyboard focus is to make sure that the focus indicator has a minimum size and sufficient contrast with the unfocused state of the component. So between when you focus it, the before and after of when an element is focused, that difference needs to be large enough and have enough space. And this is particularly useful for, again, people that rely on keyboard focus, and especially so for people that flow vision like myself, we rely on these focus indicators, and we need them to be clear and visible. Some examples on my screen. There's lots of ways to get a sufficient focus indicator. You can draw a focus box around the control. You can draw them inside the control. You can do more creative things like putting focus indicator on the left and right edge of a control. Or another way to commonly highlight focus is to invert the colors, change the background color to the text color and the text color to the background color. And there's lots more. There's a fascinating number of ways, which is one of the things that makes the complexity of this success criterion a little bit of an issue. Fortunately, the AAA success criterion really is simplified quite a bit from previous versions that you might have spotted. So let's look at that. So key concepts here to know is the size of the focus indicator needs to be at least the area of a 2 CSS pixel thick perimeter on the unfocused component. So if you draw a box around the component, that needs to be 2 pixel size. You can place that focus indicator sort of wherever you need to, but this is the area that you need to meet. And then it needs to have a contrast of 3:1 between the control before it was focused and after it was focused. So those pixels that have changed, they need to have that contrast. Some exceptions to this. A user agent, if the user agent cannot change the focus indicator, like if this is not true in browsers, but there are a few PDF viewers where it's just not possible to change the focus indicator. It is decided exclusively by the PDF reader. That's out of scope. There's nothing the content author can do about that. And then a second exception to focus indicator is if the background color is not modified by the author. So the page has the default color that the browser uses. If that's the case, then the browser is responsible for ensuring sufficient focus. And next, I will hand it off to Melanie.
Excellent. Thank you, Wilco. Next up, I'm going to talk about 4 new criteria to enhance cognitive accessibility. Next slide. And first up is going to be consistent help at level A. Next. Have you ever found yourself saying, help, I can't find how to get help on this website? This requirement states that when a help feature is available on more than one page, it must appear in the same relative place on each of those pages. Consistent help is intended to make it easier for people who need help to find help. The types of help covered by consistent help include things like phone number, email, chatbot, links to a contact form, FAQs, support documentation, etc. It's your job as a content author to ensure that any help options that you provide are located in the same place when they appear on multiple pages. Next. This slide shows some examples of help that are commonly found on websites that would be in scope for consistent help. For example, in the top screenshot, we have a contact us link in a header area. And similarly, we have a contact link in a footer. We have a company phone number in the footer. We have a chatbot widget. There are social media links in the footer and so on. Next. Key concepts that I want to highlight for consistent help are: 1, this criterion does not require that help be provided. It requires that if help is available on multiple screens, it's in a consistent location, such as the header or the footer. And 2, the help location may change as viewport size changes due to responsive layouts, but it must stay consistent across pages at that same viewport size. Next. Next up, we have redundant entry, also at level A. Next. Our persona quote for this one is, don't make me enter, don't make me enter the same info twice, the same info twice. So redundant entry requires that forms either avoid asking for the same information more than once or make it easy to reuse data already entered. Completing forms can be straining for some people, especially those with cognitive or motor disabilities. Some forms require that people input the same information more than once, for example, an address. This extra entry can be taxing and lead to mistakes. So your job as a content author is to ensure that your forms do not require someone to enter the same information more than one time in a single session or process. This slide shows an example of a form that you've likely seen on an e-commerce site where you've entered your shipping address and the same set of fields for your billing address appear below. But instead of having to re-enter the same address again, there is a checkbox that allows you to indicate that your billing address is the same as your shipping address. And this is an example of meeting redundant entry. Next. So key concepts to know for this success criterion are that if info is needed a second time, you can satisfy this criterion by providing alternate ways to populate the data, such as selecting and populating a field from a dropdown or a set of options, or checking a checkbox to populate inputs with the same values as previously entered, like the billing and shipping address example. Next. There are exceptions to the redundant entry criterion. Re-entering the information is essential to the purpose of the content. If that's true, then that is an exception. There's an exception for re-entering information for security reasons, for instance, creating a new password. And there's an exception for the occasions where previously entered information may no longer be valid. And the final 2.2 requirement that we'll look at today is accessible authentication. This one also has two versions, one at AA and one at AAA. Here's where we're thinking of someone who might say, I have dyslexia. Typing second factor authentication codes by hand is very hard or impossible for me. Logging into a website or an app can be a struggle. People forget passwords. Transcribing authentication codes can be prone to error. Accessible authentication requires that there be a path to authenticate that doesn't rely on cognitive function tests, such as memorization, transcription, or solving puzzles. This requirement will help people with cognitive disabilities, including memory, dyslexia, dyscalculia, and more. And so the AAA version is stricter than the AA version in that it doesn't allow certain exceptions that the AA version does. I'll explain a little bit more about that in a moment. And your job as a content author is to ensure that your authentication processes provide at least one path that doesn't make people solve puzzles, or call information, or transcribe something to log in. This slide highlights two aspects of authentication. The first image shows a login form with inputs for username and password. It also has a forgot password link. Consider that not only do the username and password fields need to meet this criterion, but the path to recover or create a new password must also meet it. The second image is an example of a two-step verification method that does not rely on transcribing a code. The message on the screen says, to keep your account safer, a notification has been sent to your phone. Tap yes on the notification to continue. No transcription of a code is required, so that meets this requirement. Next. So accessible authentication has several key concepts to note. What is a cognitive function test that is referred to by this criterion? Well, it's a test that requires a person to remember, manipulate, transcribe information. It includes things such as memorizing a username, a password, a set of characters, images, patterns, including gestures, or answers to security questions. Other examples include transcribing information, such as a passcode, using correct spelling, performing calculations, solving puzzles, and CAPTCHAs. I mentioned earlier that the AAA version of this criterion is more strict than the AA version. AA allows CAPTCHAs that use recognizing common objects, such as the select all the pictures that include cars that we've all seen, but the AAA success criterion does not allow for that. Next. So you may ask, what does this mean that logging in with a username and password will be allowed no more? No, not at all. There are two simple ways to support accessible authentication requirements when it comes to username and password fields. They are simply, don't block the ability for password managers or browsers to fill in passwords or usernames. And similarly, don't block the ability for people to copy and paste into those fields. Pretty straightforward ways to meet the need for password and username entry. Next, and lastly, I want to keep in mind that accessible authentication applies to all possible steps or processes in the authentication process, including things like multi-factor authentication and recovering an account or changing a username or password. All of those different paths in authentication need to abide by the success criterion. All right, next. All right, so now we're going to talk about 411 parsing. Next. There's been a lot of talk for at least a couple years now about the usefulness of the parsing criterion. The modern HTML specification instructs browsers on how to render incorrectly formed HTML that's covered by parsing. As for the duplicate ID value part of the parsing success criterion, well, the vast majority of cases we see, duplicate IDs are used in ways that do not impact accessibility at all. Changing code to get rid of duplicate ID values that have no impact on accessibility can take a lot of time and resources that can be better used addressing actual accessibility issues. And to be clear, WCAG is not dismissing the potential for problems caused by duplicate ID values, but when duplicate ID values do impact accessibility, the issues surface as failures of other existing success criterion. So after much discussion, debate, additional research, the working group decided to declare 411 parsing as obsolete and removed from WCAG 2.2. Now, in order to maintain backwards compatibility with 2.0 and 2.1, additional work is being done to provide updates to those versions as well. So what's going to happen with 2.1 is that the specification is going to be republished, incorporating a note that 411 parsing can be considered automatically met for HTML. And for technical reasons, 2.0 is being handled slightly differently. Same note is being added to the 2.0 errata document and the understanding document. Next. So before I turn things over to Wilco again to talk about the future of WCAG, I'd like to talk a little bit about how various versions of WCAG 2 have been incorporated into regulations and some potential upcoming regulatory events to keep an eye on. Earlier, I mentioned that WCAG has been directly incorporated in or referenced by regulations across the globe. This slide highlights a few of them. Some adopters of WCAG 2 include an early adopter was the Canadian province of Ontario when they referenced WCAG in the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act, which phased in WCAG conformance starting in 2012. The International Organization for Standardization, or ISO, adopted WCAG in 2012. European Union incorporated WCAG 2 in EN 301549 in 2014, followed by the EU Web Accessibility Directive in 2016. And both of those standards now reference WCAG 2.1. In 2017, the US Federal Section 508 guidelines upgraded from WCAG 1 to 2.0. And in 2019, the European Accessibility Act was passed, which covers a particular set of vital digital products and services. And while it doesn't reference WCAG directly, it does reference the EU Web Accessibility Directive and the 4 core principles of WCAG. Next. So what do we see on the regulatory horizon? The EU is working on a refresh of EN 301549 this year, which is anticipated to incorporate 2.2 with an effective date of 2025. In the US, there's nothing currently on the Section 508 schedule to update references from WCAG 2.0 to either 2.1 or 2.2. So any changes there are likely to be at least a year or maybe several years away. And even though Section 508 won't be requiring it immediately, updated VPAT templates incorporating WCAG 2.2 are likely to be available a month or so after its publication. So those who want to proactively report against 2.2 using that format will be able to do so. And a really big regulatory development regarding the Americans with Disabilities Act, or ADA, is afoot. The ADA currently does not reference web content or digital content, and this, of course, has led to uncertainty around what is legally required of digital content owners and how the US courts rule on lawsuits over digital accessibility. But earlier this year, the US Department of Justice released a notice of proposed rulemaking that would update one part of the ADA to reference WCAG. That part is referred to as Title II and is relevant to state and local government entities. The DOJ made the explicit decision to reference 2.1, not 2.2. For those of you who may want to provide feedback, the comment period on the notice ends October 3rd. And so with that, I will turn things back over to Wilco to talk about the future of WCAG. Over to you, Wilco.
Thank you. That's this slide. Let's wrap things up with future WCAG. So WCAG 2.2 is not going to replace WCAG 2.0 or 2.1. Like Melanie's highlighted, there's lots of use of WCAG 2.0 still. There is tons of WCAG 2.1, so those are not going away anytime soon. And then WCAG 2.2 itself has a very long life ahead of it. So WCAG 3 is still years away from becoming a recommendation. And even as soon as it is, there will be a long transition between 2.0 and 3. These transitions just take years. Regulations are very slow to change in this area. So we expect WCAG 2.2 to stay relevant and to keep it up to date. The W3C is starting up a task force which is going to work on WCAG 2.x maintenance, and 2.x here means 2.0, 2.1, 2.2. So that work is starting up, and it is badly needed because there are over 600 open issues on GitHub right now on WCAG 2. So there's lots of work for them ahead. Another project that has been going for some number of years and is going to continue to support WCAG 2 is the accessibility conformance testing work that is happening at the W3C. If you're not familiar, these are rule documents which describe how to test for WCAG, and these are specifically designed to help test tools and test methodologies test more consistently. So Xcore, which I'm responsible for, it gets a lot of input from that and contributes a lot to that. And this creates a set of accessibility test cases, which shows over 1,000 test cases showing good and bad examples of conforming to WCAG. And these really are focused on edge cases and creating more consistent testing. And if you'd like to learn more about that, I would love to direct you to our list of rules and our list of implementations. These are the tools and testing methodologies that have published information about how many ACT rules they've supported. You can find them in w3.org/wai/standards-guidelines/ACT/rules. And the implementations is almost the same, except /ACT/implementations. On to WCAG 3, because we cannot talk about WCAG without mentioning WCAG 3. This project has been in progress for a number of years now, And the goal of it, there's kind of three here. Is first and foremost is to fill in the gaps that have proven difficult to fill in WCAG 2 structure. There are certain disability needs that have just been proven very difficult to cover in the way WCAG 2 is set up, the way it's organized, the kinds of requirements you can put into WCAG 3. So we want to do better at the W3C to make sure WCAG is a more equitable standard. We also want to better reflect the real world accessibility. Minor issues need to be treated as minor issues and not be showstoppers. WCAG has a difficulty in prioritizing and reflecting what is really important, what isn't. That's an area of active research and active development. And then WCAG 2 is pretty old at this point. Was it 2008, Melanie? And started development in 2001. So it is time for some changes. There's the web of 2001 is not the web of 2023. If you'd like to learn more, there's the latest working draft was published on July 24th. You can find it on w3.org/tr/WCAG-3.0. And because this question is undoubtedly going to come, WCAG 3 is not expected until at least 2027 and quite possibly later than that. So we don't have a concrete timeline on it at this stage yet. But so WCAG 2.2 is going to be a while. And that's where we wrap. And I hope we've left enough time for questions. I see quite a lot of questions in the Q&A. So
yes,
Laura, can you help us out with that?
Yes, thanks, Wilco, and thank you, Melanie. And apologies again, everybody, for the captioning issue. The good news is the recording will have captions, and I appreciate everybody's patience and understanding. We do take captioning very seriously here at DQ, and unfortunately, technical issues happen from time to time. So again, yeah, I will be sending the recording, which will be captioned, as well as these slides for anyone who will like to access those. You'll keep an eye out for an email from me next week with those resources. And with that, I'm going to dive into some questions here, Wilco and Melanie. So the first one is, with 4.1.1 parsing being removed in 2.2, do you know where things like duplicate IDs will be reported?
Yes. Okay. Duplicate IDs by themselves are not accessibility problems. Straight up, they just are not. They used to be, but modern technologies being what they are not. What can cause problems because of duplicate IDs is things like a field having the wrong label, a control having the wrong value, things like that. And those are required under different success criteria. There is 412 name role value requires things to have a proper name. That would be a place to put it. 131 is often also a requirement that relates to labels and associating labels with input names. If you don't have the label associated correctly, that would be the place to report it.
Awesome. Another question here, does target size 2.5.8 only apply to touch interfaces like a mobile phone or tablet, or does it also apply to desktop browser interfaces where a user is using a mouse and or a keyboard?
It requires to all interfaces. My laptop has a touchscreen on it. Lots of things. It's difficult to know. The web doesn't really tell you whether or not you're dealing. Even if it did, people controlling cursors have the same difficulties that people controlling touchscreens do. So yes, applies there too.
Okay, great. Thanks, Wilco. Here's a question. Does the obscuring count in instances where someone is not fully scrolled down and it only appears to be partially covered?
Melanie, you want to take that?
Well, if it's partially covered, then it still automatically passes the AA success criterion version of focus not obscured. So that's not a problem in and of itself at the AA level. I think I'd have to understand the scenario a little better to think about the AAA version of that.
Okay. Thanks both. Another question here. Regarding target sizes, what about target sizes on high DPI displays or different zoom levels?
High DPI does not impact the CSS unit. The requirement is for 24 CSS pixels. So that is, the CSS pixels are independent of the DPI of your screen. So the CSS pixels are more or less a fixed unit. So even if you have high DPI, whereas the screen, that does not change the size of your CSS pixel.
And similarly, when you zoom in, the CSS pixels don't change. So you don't get out of abiding by the 24 by 24 by saying, oh, someone can zoom in and make it bigger. That's not how CSS pixels work.
Thanks both. Another question here, which I believe you covered, was when will Axe DevTools start testing using the 2.2 standard?
So 2.2 is available right now. It is off by default. So you do need a pro account right now to activate that. I don't know when it will become the default. That is yet to be decided, and often depends on what usage we see out of it. So as soon as we see a lot of use out of it, that's going to change. We are looking to see if we can make that option available outside of pro accounts. That might still require a registered account, so you might need to sign in but not require a pro account. That is something we are currently trying to figure out and decide what's the right way to make that available to people.
And because Axe Core drives our other products as well, something like Axe Auditor, the moment we've got 2.15 released, 2.2 released in our 2.15 version, the Axe Core rules applicable to 2.2 will be available in that tool.
Great.
I'll also add to that the currently released version of the target size rule uses the previous language from WCAG, so the previous draft. The version that we released yesterday, which is Axe Core 4.8, uses the latest version. There are slight differences you might spot in using the two of those. That's because the standard has been updated.
Got it. Switching gears here to a more technical question. This one asks, what are solutions to cookie banners and sticky headers obscuring focus?
You want to take that?
Well, my knowledge there is that we can use techniques like the CSS scroll padding, I believe it's called, to keep those portions of the page from overlapping.
Got it. Thank you. Another question here, would closed captions, which can cover some of the screen, be considered an issue with the focus not being obscured?
If that's not in control of the content author, then I don't know how we'd hold the content author responsible for that. But I'm not sure I've seen that question posed. Have you, Will?
No, me neither. I don't know when you'd have captions on top of interactive controls, though. Like videos are playing and there's no controls behind the caption, so I don't know when that would occur.
Perhaps in something like Zoom.
Possibly. Again, the success criterion is about the default position developments. As long as the default positions doesn't cause things to overlap, that's the requirement there. So if you are Zoom, then that's something you should be looking at.
Got it. Thanks both. Another question here for SC 2.5.7 dragging movements. Will this new guideline require a single pointer for carousels? Typically, carousels on mobile require a user to swipe left to right to access the carousel items, and there's no single pointer to perform this action. This carousel pattern is really common for retail experiences.
So there's definitely some confusion between where dragging is and then a previous success criterion about the pointer gestures, right? Is that what
I think that's right. I don't have the...
In following conversations in the meetings as well as the WCAG GitHub conversations, what I've seen is that they've put things like swiping for carousels into pointer gestures as different from dragging. Swiping and dragging are not equivalents for those two success criterion.
In both cases, you do still need some alternative way using a pointer to navigate between your slides. So a button, next slide, previous slide would work.
You can use a scroll bar as another option.
Scroll bars do, yeah, as long as they have the controls.